Hello, my name is Aaron Claiborne with Wisconsin Voices for Recovery. And today we have Rachel here to share her experiences about stigma. How are you doing today, Rachel?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me.
That's awesome. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Happy to be.
So now I'd like to ask you, how does stigma harm people seeking or in recovery?
Sure. So, one of the big ways in which stigma harms people who are seeking treatment or seeking recovery is that it creates three levels of barriers for them. One is the stigma that they feel from people, right? The individual levels of stigma. So, well, I don't want to, be your friend or work with you or live next door to you, and when that results in shame and social isolation and just not feeling connected and like you have any sort of support. And that can come also from family and friends, which of course adds an extra level of barriers when you're talking about trying to engage in those help seeking behaviors. Secondly, one of the other ways that it forms a barrier is structurally, right? So people make policies, people develop structures, and our own internal biases and stigmas get codified into those structures that we create. So you can see that when you're looking at people who maybe can't gain employment when they're in recovery because of perhaps of a history with the carceral system. You can see that in terms of how sometimes not all types of medications for opioid use disorder are covered by a healthcare policy. You can see that, even more broadly when you just look at things that are not available to people in society because they may be in treatment or recovery. So that is another way in which stigma is a barrier. And then lastly, there's the conversation around self-stigma, right? Which happens when people who have a substance use disorder or who use drugs internalize those stereotypes about themselves, that they should be ashamed of themselves, that they're not worth anything, that it's their fault, that they are a bad character, they have bad character or something like that. And when you believe something like that about yourself, it's really hard to convince yourself to maybe seek help about anything, let alone something that's already so stigmatized and vulnerable as a substance use disorder or an addiction.
Yeah, it makes it very difficult. Thank you for that,
Sure.
Rachel. Now I'd like to ask you, how does stigma against people perpetuate substance use disorder?
Yeah, and I think that ties back, to what we were just talking about, Aaron, in that if you can't seek help because you're too ashamed, because the structures aren't in place, because you don't have coverage, because you don't know where to go or who to ask, then frequently that can result in a worsening of substance use or, for that matter, other mental health conditions, right? So if you're not doing well and your main coping strategy, for example, maybe is, it could be any sort of substance, right? But if that's your main coping strategy and things aren't getting better, then it very well may end up where you end up using more to cope with said isolation, with said shame, with said fear of being vulnerable. It does also mean that, in the event where somebody does end up, using again, when we talk about substance use disorders, we do talk about them as a chronic, relapsing, but curable medical state, right? And relapsing or remission or coming out of and using again is something that's common. It's as common as, other people with other chronic conditions and not, taking their meds or whatever the case may be. It's the same rate, but we treat it differently. So it also can mean that when somebody does relapse or does start using again, that they are more ashamed and less likely to seek help. And that's really, really dangerous, especially as far as opioid overdoses go and the using alone conversation. So that's certainly a driver as well of really negative outcomes and worsening of substance use over time.
Thank you, Rachel. Great information. Great information.
Sure.
So now I'd like to ask you, what would you want people to know and remember about those who are seeking or in recovery?
I mean, first and foremost, we're all human and we all have the things, that we struggle with. And we all talk about things like, well, walk a mile in their shoes or put yourself in their mindset and we don't, it's hard to do that when we haven't lived something. And we can't predicate understanding and being compassionate on, well, I understand because I've lived it. What we all have to do is really truly understand that everybody has their own experiences, everybody has their own levels of life that they bring to the table, and it sometimes it results in large part in substance use. It can. And what does that look like? But at the end of the day, we're all human, and our ability to receive help, to receive love, should not be predicated on anything aside from just the fact that we're human.
That
Thank
is
you.
very, very true. Again, more great information to share with our viewers. Very knowledgeable. Rachel, is there anything you'd like to share with our audience in our last 30 seconds or so?
I would just say, keep thinking about this critically. You know, we all have our internal biases, our own stigmas, and it doesn't make any of us bad people either. It's just an opportunity for growth, an opportunity to learn. So don't be, too hard on yourself. Sometimes we can think about this and be like, oh man, I should not have said that, or I shouldn't have done that. It makes me feel like a bad person, or whatever the case may be. We can all, do better. We all can keep learning, and we're all human as well. So give yourself grace, give everybody else grace, and let's move forward together to really working to end addiction stigma.
That was more great information. We tend to be hard on ourselves when we feel we're impolitically correct or
Yep.
offensive, and that's great information. I'd like to thank you again, Rachel, for being here. You were spectacular. I loved it. And it was just a great overall great interview.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated being here.
Definitely a pleasure here. All right, everybody, please check out Wisconsin Voices for Recovery Facebook page every single day in the month of July for others sharing their experiences about stigma. Rachel, again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
All right, you too. Have a great rest of your day.